Hi everyone, welcome to another cheeky little video from me before the weekend. Just thought I'd do another quick fun one, hopefully fun. This is in response, it's not really in response, this is really inspired by a couple of videos I've seen recently by Jeff Party and Brian Shamrock. A couple of days ago, a week ago, Brian showed a John Martin record which he'd bought. Didn't know what it was, didn't know what it was like. He played it and he had to kind of rip off his stylus almost immediately because it was one of John's very 80s kind of albums, and Brian doesn't like that kind of 80s synth drum machine kind of things. And then Jeff just showed quite a few Van Morrison albums, and he got talking about the period in the 80s when Van started to make slightly dodgy new age style music, and you know, even though the songs were kind of good, sometimes it was the 80s production that slightly got in the way. And that gave me the idea to do a thread about, you know, good albums or decent albums which were slightly spoilt by having been produced in the 1980s. Now, being produced in the 80s was not always a bad thing. Obviously, some great music came out of the 80s. And, you know, bad 80s production can take many shapes and forms. You get very bad sounding synth sometimes, or drum machines. But by the same token, you also had, you know, guitars and real drum kits all of a sudden sounding a little bit thin, not quite as rounded and warm sounding as they had done in the 1970s. You know, as things became more and more digital, I suppose. I've always found it quite interesting, you know, trying to identify what actually is it about certain 80s records which makes them sound not as good. You know, as music from previous eras or from music that came after. You know, you get into the 1990s and all of a sudden bands that had been making quite kind of bad sounding music, all of a sudden they started to sound alright again. Very strange. So in fact this first artist is an example of that. I'm going to show 5 records. I'm not going to spend too long over them. The first one is Now and Zen by Robert Plant, which came out in 1988. Contains some good material, you know, heaven knows, it's all cool one, but there's definitely a surplus of quite 80s sounding keyboards on this, a little bit tinny on the ear, a little bit not very satisfying. Robert made a few 80s style records in the 80s. This is just one of them, but it sprung to mind because I actually really like the songs on this, and it's a bit of a shame that it does slightly suffer from that 80s sound. The next one will be familiar to lots of you. This is Press to Play, Paul McCartney, from 1986. Tends to be slagged off a lot for being a bad album. I don't think it's as bad as its reputation suggests. I think it's got some perfectly okay songs on here. It's the record that he did in collaboration with Eric Stewart. There's some okay stuff, you know, Press, Pretty Little Head, Angry. It's just that it has a very boomy 80s sound. Hugh Padgham produced it. It has that very clattery sound on the drums, that kind of, you know, classic Phil Collins. It's all just a bit boomy, and a bit not very nice. The third one I've got for you, Pink Floyd, Momentary Lapse of Reason. It's got some perfectly okay songs on it, Learning to Fly, Dogs of War, One Slip. It's not vintage Floyd for me, you know, it's far from my favourite Floyd album, but it certainly doesn't sound like any Floyd album that had gone before. It was recorded using entirely new systems. It was definitely not an analogue recording. Quite a lot of cold synth sounds on here. A very, very distinctively 80s bass sound and drum sound. And when they came to do the Division Bell a few years later, which I believe was in the early 90s, that album stands up a lot more sonically, I think, to this one. Although this one, I would argue, actually has the better songs of the two. Squeeze, Così fan tutti frutti. This is their comeback album in 1985, I believe. And again, it contains some good songs. It contains the hits Last Time Forever. It contains There's No Place Like Home, which is a good song, but it was produced by Laurie Latham, and it is just one of those all-whiz, all-banging, crashing 80s records, you know, far too many synthesizers. Gilson Lavis is playing synthesized, you know, drum pads and everything. It was them trying to compete with, you know, bands that they thought at the time were a lot more you know, cool and successful, you know, bands like Japan and so on, but it doesn't really suit Squeeze's style. Some good songwriting, but definitely, you know, a beast of the 80s. That's Squeeze and Cozy Fan Tutti Frutti. And to finish with, we have The Miracle by Queen from 1989. Queen had made a virtue all the way through the 70s of using no synthesizers. They'd always said, you know, on their album sleeves, no synths. From the early 80s onwards, they started to use synthesizers, and by the time you get to this album, they're using a lot of synthesizers. And they tended to use presets, so you hear things like, you know, the presets on the Roland D50, digital synthesizer feature on this record. You can hear them on the Invisible Man, but also the guitars just sound thin. There's something very thin about the guitar sound. If you compare it to the guitar sound on previous albums, you know, whatever, News of the World, or even The Game, which is right at the start of the 80s, the guitar sounds on this do not sound like full-blooded guitar sounds. Something had happened to them, and only Brian May knows what that is. So there we go, 5 records, show 5 records from the 80s which suffer from an 80s production despite not being bad records in themselves. I look forward to seeing your choices. Have a great weekend.